I am so honored to share the stage with Michael Shnayerson. I'm so grateful to have all of you join me for what I think will be a very lively and informative conversation. We are going to speak for a bit, and then towards the end, we will open it up for questions from the audience, of which I'm sure there will be many. So I think, Michael, if it's okay, we can just kick it off. All right. Well, I am most curious about how this subject, the rise of the contemporary art market, captured your attention and became the subject of, an incredible book that reads so smoothly, so thoughtfully, and is full of amazing anecdotes. How did this whole thing come about?
Well, the first thing I should probably do is come clear and say, I am not an art critic. I'm not an art collector. When I started this, I didn't know a lot about art, but that's actually why I started it. Just as an observer, as an amateur, really, I had, observed the prices going crazy at auction. I live on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, surrounded by art galleries. Larry Gagosian is 2 blocks away. He intrigued me. And I thought maybe I could be the voice, be the eyes, so to speak, for other amateurs, for people who wanted to know what this world was about. And when you're a journalist, you can just sort of do that, act on your curiosity. So I signed up to do that, and in a matter of months realized I had made a terrible mistake. And the mistake was that I thought I could tell the whole story of contemporary art from the post-war days on to now, from when a few artists and dealers were hanging around in Greenwich Village to this global bonanza we have now. That would have drowned me. I had to do something to cut it back. And I realized after a while what it was. My story was really the dealers, not so much the artists or the collectors or the curators or the museum people. They were all part of the story. But really the theme, the central storyline was the dealers, because you can't have art without artists, but you really can't have art without dealers either. And from the very beginning of that period, these were people who had promoted artists, who'd really made their careers happen. I think sometimes dealers get a bum rap. We sort of think of them as conniving somehow, and I'm sure that some of them are. But the ones I met and the ones I studied were very passionate about what they did. And it was the beginning of a great ride. So that's how I decided.
That's wonderful. And how did you get them to because you interviewed clearly so many people for this book, and it seems like you got a lot of candor and honesty and really kind of sharp observations from many of the dealers whom you met with. Can you talk a little bit about how it was to kind of get them on board with this project? Was it challenging?
For the most part, it wasn't that hard to get dealers to talk about themselves. It's like most of us, really. It wasn't even that hard to get some of the best-known dealers to talk with me. And now I'm talking about the mega dealers, and we'll hear more about them later. But there are, over the last 5 or 10 years, there have emerged really 4 mega dealers, the top dogs in the whole business. And the top of them all is Larry Gagosian. And it did take me a long time to convince him to talk to me. So I had to fall back on the classic journalistic exercise of interviewing everybody on the way up the food chain. And once you've interviewed everyone else, then they don't want to be left out. And so that is what I did. And they all wanted to know each what the others had said. And I found myself in an unexpected position of power over them in just that little way. Anyway, it's not so difficult as you would think to get them to talk to you, because these people are really passionate about contemporary art, whether they collect it, curate it, deal it. It becomes really the most dominant thing in their lives, and they like to talk about it.
Was it difficult in any way for them to talk about, sales, or to be transparent about certain aspects of the market, which, as we've recently just chatted, the market itself is so opaque, and that's been part of its engine of growth.
Yes, it is. It is, as they say, the largest unregulated legal business in the world. And dealers like it that way. They don't want to change. Really, all they have to do to conform with the law, is to have a piece of paper that says, okay, I'm buying this painting from Mr. So-and-so here, and he's agreed to it, and I'm going to pay my taxes on whatever I got from the sale. And that's it. That's pretty much as far as the law goes in regard to contemporary art. So, for instance, if I'm a big dealer and I take on someone's painting and I say I can get you, I think I get you $1 million for that painting. So the understanding would be, okay, so I'll keep 30%, 40%, whatever I'm going to keep. But the seller of the painting doesn't necessarily have any idea if I can make more than that, and if I can get another $1 million, I can pocket it. It's really quite a racket in that way. So anyway, yes, it's opaque. As I was just saying to Nora, a friend of mine had dinner with Larry Gagosian not that long ago, and people around a table, and they all had some champagne, and they all raised their glass to the great unregulated business that contemporary art is. And they said, don't let it ever change. And my friend said that it was Larry himself who said that, and he should, because he's become an incredibly wealthy man, the biggest dealer in the world, thanks to that lack of regulation.
The book kind of follows I would say, the professional and somewhat personal arcs of two kind of main figures, Larry Gagosian being one and Leo Castelli being the kind of earlier generation.
Right.
To me, as you describe them and as you kind of bring that history, especially with Leo, to life, they really have a kind of, in my interpretation, was a bit of kind of tragic heroes, that they achieved a lot, but at certain costs. Leo was a visionary in the 50s and the 60s, and then kind of couldn't keep up maybe with market tastes and trends. And Larry Gagosian is obviously the kind of constant source of others, maybe ire, and also kind of, yet also the standard, or a standard to whom many aspire. Did you see them in that way as you were
Well, to be
pulling the
honest,
chapters
I didn't see too much tragic about them. I mean, there are other things we can say about them, and we
Please
will.
do.
And we will. Well, okay. Let me start with Leo. In fact, let me start with quickly two people who are instrumental in this story. And I'm going to try over this hour to keep going back to the story, because to me that's what's the most fascinating part is the chronology of all this, who these characters were, how one led to another. So the two dealers that really started this all off were Betty Parsons and Sidney Janis, and they were New Yorkers who were passionate about the art that they saw unfolding around them. We're talking now 1947, war is just over, and the whole genre of abstract expressionism arises. Why? Because it's essentially an expression of anger and frustration and passion about the war and the fact that the world has crumbled all around them. When I think of abstract expressionism, I think of Pollock, I think of de Kooning, and I think of these fierce brushstrokes that defined what they did. And Betty and Sidney were fascinated by these people. And Betty, at a certain point in 1949, having just scraped the money together to get her own gallery on 57th Street, had four of the most important artists, as it turned out, of that whole period. Rothko, Pollock, Barnett Newman, and your own Clifford Still. And she was passionate on their account, but she was also such a sort of empathetic person that she let a lot of young artists into her stable, which really teed off the four horsemen, as she called it, the big guys. And one by one, they left, and they literally moved down the hall to Sidney's gallery because he had rented his space from Betty. Betty was furious. See, here he was down the hall stealing her artists. And indeed, Pollock went from Betty to Sidney. De Kooning actually didn't start with Betty, but he went to Janice rather than to Betty. He has a little story to just tell. Sidney actually grew up in a family that worked in the garment industry, and he was a very smart guy, and he had this great idea that he made a fortune from, the two-pocket shirt. Now you might say, what is the two-pocket shirt? Well, Southern men especially, in the heat, wanted to doff their jackets, but they had all these things to put in their pockets, pen protectors and stuff like that. So a shirt that had two pockets on the front rather than one was a very useful thing. Well, Sidney made a fortune from it. And he never needed to work in the garment district again. Instead, he just worked as a dealer. And so those guys got the 50s on a roll. And then came Leo, our friend Leo. And I would say that I adore Leo and Larry in equal measure. I just find them fascinating characters, and I find it even more fascinating that they got to know each other, and that in a very real way, the whole history of contemporary art hinged on their friendship. So, to start it off, maybe some of you know, Leo came from Europe, immigrant family, during the war, just as the war began, really just barely got away with their lives, and came to New York, although unlike most people in that position, he was in comfortable circumstances. He had married, as it turned out, a rather wealthy woman. And she had a family father who bought a townhouse for them all at 4 East 77th Street. And Leo began working for his knitwear factory somewhere outside of New York City. And he was kind of a guy you would think didn't have much ambition. In fact, the same would be said later of Larry. It was because he was kind of more given to just flaneuring around the lower Manhattan galleries and talking to the dealers and hanging out, really. You might have called him a dilettante in sort of the best sense, that he had the money to just pursue his interests. But finally he decided that he would start his own gallery, and that was 1957. He needed at least a couple artists, a couple new artists that he could claim were his own. And he found one in Robert Rauschenberg, who was just beginning to do these combines, or literally combining sort of found objects and creating these sculptures. Very interesting stuff. But he still needed another one. And one day he went to the Jewish Museum, and there was a show of new young artists. And one of them had done a painting that looked almost like a green circle or target. And the name was Jasper Johns. And so Castelli sort of put it in his mind to check that guy out at some point later. And then he went a day or two later to join his wife, Ileana, at Robert Rauschenberg's studio downtown, because they were going to pick the art that was going to be in the first show, the gallery's first show, and Rauschenberg's first show with them. And so they're in his loft, and Rauschenberg gave Leo a glass of whiskey or something, and Leo said, "Well, do you have a little ice?" And Rauschenberg said, "Well, no, I don't, but my neighbor downstairs, Jasper, does." And Castelli went, "Wait, Jasper? Jasper? Is that Jasper Johns?" "Yes," said Rauschenberg. What he didn't add is that actually Johns was his lover. It was a very complicated relationship. But they went downstairs, they opened the door, Jasper Johns welcomed them in, and there were like 20 incredible Jasper Johns paintings on the walls that no one in the world had yet seen. And later, Leo described it as his sort of coup de foudre. It was just the most exciting moment of his life. And of course, he asked and pleaded that Johns sign on with him, and Johns agreed. So first there was a show of Rauschenberg, and then there was a show for Johns. And at that show, there was great excitement. By now, this art, it was very clear that something was happening beyond abstract expressionism, something that these two artists were doing. And so there's great excitement. This guy, Alfred Barr, who was the head of the Museum of Modern Art, came to the show, and he wanted to buy as many as he could. He bought about 3, and then there was a 4th one. And if you know Jasper Johns' work a little bit, it was a target painting, and across the top were these little wooden compartments that had these little doors that opened up. And one of them was opened, and inside was a penis. Well, an artistic rendering of a penis. And
it was a cast, I think.
yes, a cast. And it was a cast, and Barr was aghast. And he said to Johns, would you mind if we bought that and just kept that little door closed? And John said, I'm so sorry, Mr. Barr. He was a Southerner. I'm sorry, but I can't do that. I think it would have to be open. And Barr said, well, how about if it was open just some of the time, like maybe off hours? No, Mr. Barr, I'm sorry. It would have to be open all the time. And with that, Barr had to pass on buying that Target painting, which I think went to Philip Johnson, the architect. Anyway, Leo was off and running.
Who then I think donated it to MoMA.
Okay, there we go. Leo was off and running, and very soon, as you may know, he began representing a whole new wave of pop artists, Rothko and Warhol and Lichtenstein and other names you probably know. And it was a really fun time. I loved, by the time I was up in the 60s, there were people who were still alive to interview. And one of them was a guy named Jim Jacobs, who was a young guy, and this gives you a little sense of Castelli Gallery in the 60s. They actually didn't have much money at the end of every month. Leo was very casual about what he charged for his paintings. If someone tried to bargain him down, he let them bargain him down. And they'd run out of money. So Jim Jacobs' job was to go make posters of whoever's having a show coming up, just run off a lot of posters and have the artists sign them all. So you were creating a lot of art that way. Of course, it was posters, not real paintings, but it could help forestall the bill collectors. So Jim went to Robert Rauschenberg's, and Rauschenberg said, I can't be bothered with this. Have Bryce over there sign them. And that was this guy with a push broom whose name was Bryce Marden, who is now one of the most famous abstract artists in the world. And Andy Warhol, on the other hand, said, sure, I'll sign them, or let anyone sign them, I don't care. Jasper Johns, very particular. He wanted only he could sign them. But this was kind of a sense of the mood then. And the other thing to say about it is that I had a friend who recently died, Don Marin, who was a great collector of work from that time. And he said that it was the most exciting day of his life when he was finally let behind the red velvet rope. Well, this was the red velvet rope in Castelli's gallery, behind which Castelli sat. And if you were just an ordinary customer, you couldn't get back there. If you were Don Marin and you'd worked at it and tried to be polite, showed you were a legitimate dealer, he would let you back there. But it didn't necessarily mean that he would sell you the paintings on the wall. Don would ask, could I buy this one? Could I buy that one? And Castelli would say, well, maybe. We'll see. And that was the way Castelli was. And I want to get to Larry, but am I talking too much?
Absolutely not.
Okay. The 60s was a glorious time in contemporary art. The 50s, the 60s, the 80s, I would say now is a glorious time.
Do you mean the contemporary art market?
The contemporary art.
I mean
contemporary art,
kind of more
really. Although the market keeps on. What I was going to say is that the 70s is kind of a lull in most ways. It's certainly a lull in the market because the economy was very poor in New York.
But that's when a lot of great art was made.
Yes, well, that's true. I mean, so let's keep to the market. There, you're right. And actually, there was a sale, many of you may know, in 1973, the Skull Sale, in which for the first time, a lot of incredible paintings by the pop artists, by Johns, Rauschenberg, were put up for sale by the very wealthy taxi magnate who had assembled this collection, Robert Skull. And they sold for unbelievably greater amounts than anyone ever expected. So there was great excitement about that. But by the end of the 70s, there was, I guess, a need for a sort of new chapter in the market. And that was when, by coincidence, Larry Gagosian came to New York from California. He didn't know anybody in New York. He didn't have an MFA. He didn't know Leo. He just thought he would look around, see what he could find out. He was a very sort of tough, aggressive guy who no one would have expected would become a dealer at all, much less a very admired one, very famous one, I should say. But he had a sense that, you know, the market, things were shifting in New York, and that he should go there from California, where he'd grown up. He'd grown up in an Armenian community in Fresno. His family was not wealthy at all. He told me he never heard of anyone who had a second car or a weekend house. And after college, he took a series of jobs that were sort of, nowhere jobs, working in a grocery store, record store, and this and such. Finally, he took a job in a parking garage, and every day he would see this guy come up, park on the street, and take these posters out of the trunk of his car and sell them to people going by. And Larry later said, you know, he could do that. I mean, it was easy. You just bought the posters and you put them in your car and you sold them. And so that's what he did. And he moved up that food chain a little bit. Next thing, he got frames to put the posters in. You could make a good markup on that. And then he actually started representing artists and their art and putting that in frame. He was still nowhere, a nobody, when he came to New York in 1979. But that's when he met Leo Castelli. And to the surprise, perhaps, of both men, they really liked each other. Leo saw in Larry this sort of rough, ambitious guy that he wished he himself had been a little more of growing up. Larry saw in Leo this very urbane, intellectual guy who spoke 5 languages, and Larry wished he'd been that. So that's a long way of answering your question about tragic heroes, but at least it gets us to them together.
And thank you for all of that. It's just, you kind of bring it to life in a whole new way.
Thank you.
I think, Larry Gagosian is certainly a towering figure in the art world, and he's not beloved, I would say, which is why I found a lot of the quotes and comments that you share in the book, it's very humanizing, frankly, because you hear about events or incidents or reflections on the past from him that kind of are, I don't know, you can take some of the drama or supposition of what other people imagined happened, and here he is saying, the only reason I was selling posters is because, I was making more money than parking cars. It was as simple as that. There's nothing beyond that. I mean, we can kind of try to project something, but essentially, and there are a lot of those kinds of moments where, it wasn't conniving, it wasn't manipulative, it was just, that was this, and
sort of blunt.
Indeed.
I think that he's fooling us a little bit because he's a very smart man, first of all. And he knew there was a difference between posters and widgets. Sometimes he'll say, if that guy had been selling widgets, I would be a widget salesman today. Not really, no. And I think in a couple interviews, I saw hints of his passion for art, even though I think he was almost embarrassed to show it because he didn't think that anyone would take him seriously. So he sort of played the role of the tough guy. Maybe it helped him get deals done. I mean, his whole way of doing deals is still is very different from Leo. I mean, Leo has a gallery, the artists are represented. You come in, you make an offer. Larry was a street guy, essentially. And just to give you an important distinction here, Leo was generally a primary artist dealer. In other words, he took on an artist for the first time, sold that guy's work. That was the primary sale. Anything that happened after that is secondary. So if the work that's been sold goes to an auction or someone sells it to someone else, that's secondary. Essentially, it's trading. You're just buying and selling art. and Larry was very good at at seeing what one collector's need might be and how it might dovetail with another collector's. And if he got even a scintilla of interest from the first party, they were both, they were stuck. They'd never get away from this, because Larry would call them each like 20 times a day, trying to move the price up here, get this guy, until he sold what he'd intended to sell. And that was a way of presiding as a dealer that many people look down their noses at. So again, I think that he said, well, if that's the way they're going to think of me, fine, I'll do it, and I'll outsell them while I'm at it.
Can you, I don't know if you can answer this, but who kind of invented the idea of the gallery show where nothing is for sale? It's just a kind of, it's a more curated, because
Right.
everything is still for sale. But
I don't know for sure if it was Larry, but if it wasn't, he was pretty close.
Yeah.
Because there were times, and we were talking about this a little bit before, there were times when the market had taken a dip, when it was going to be harder to sell the new paintings of some artists he represented. And so what Larry did was these historical shows. Picasso, for instance, there were 2 or 3 Picasso shows. And he had made inroads with the family, and he had persuaded them to loan him whatever, whether it was paintings or busts or, contraptions. Picasso did so many different things. And then he would get a guy like John Richardson, the wonderful art historian who died recently, to write, not only to write the catalog or whatever, but to curate the show. And people came with maybe some skepticism, but they left in awe, because this was, just as good as a little piece of, MoMA. And it was theoretically a non-selling show, so you'd ask, well, why did Gagosian do it if he wasn't making money from it? But he was getting credibility, a lot of credibility, and that certainly translated into sales somewhere down the line.
And the kind of cynic in me suspects that there were things that were not for sale that were definitely
I think
that
you're
definitely
right.
sold
Yes.
to other people.
I have heard that about him in various, yeah, right.
Can we talk a little bit about another dealer who you introduce in the book in the late 70s, early 80s, Mary Boone?
Oh, yes.
And her role in
I
all
think,
of this.
I think Mary Boone played an absolutely pivotal role in the 80s. Just at the time, 1979, when Gagosian was arriving, getting to know Leo, taking a loft right across from 420 West Broadway, where Leo now was sort of presiding as the king of this great co-op of dealers. And I always loved the image of Larry sort of up in his loft looking down at Leo, thinking one day, I'll be him. Anyway, right across the street, in that same co-op that Leo was in, was Mary Boone, a young, very beautiful, petite, Egyptian-born woman who had quite a bit of training as a dealer, and had decided to take a small space in 420. And the brilliance of that move was that the space she took was basically the broom closet, but it didn't matter, because she could still say she was at 420 West Broadway with Leo Castelli. And then when people went by her in the lobby to go to the big elevator, go up to the other dealers' floors, they always passed her in her little thing. It was almost like a toll booth taker, And she was clever enough to, to create a relationship with Leo where Leo, the much older man, I think it's fair to say, his ego was stroked by this very attractive young woman. And she persuaded him to co-curate a show with Julian Schnabel, the later famous artist of the broken plates, who actually was doing broken plates at about that time. And it was a very exciting sort of double gallery show that certainly put Julian Schnabel on the map and put Mary Boone on the map too. And she went on to find other important artists that all kind of fit the milieu that she was creating. David Sally, Eric Fischel, Ross Bleckner, Jean-Michel Basquiat sometimes, for a brief period. And this actually became a defined enough group to be called Neo-Expressionists. And it was almost the last time that there would be such a defined group. And we'll talk about that, how everything is much more amorphous now. But Mary was, you know, when she was hot, there was no one hotter in sort of the early to late 80s, really. Sadly, she is currently in jail for tax evasion. And that actually is a pity. I think she just let her least good instincts get the best of her. But she's played a big role.
Absolutely. And I think that she in a sense was like almost kind of in between Gagosian's ascent and Leo's, you know, as he was kind of teetering, she kind of helped create this new opportunity, certainly identifying and defining a whole new scene of New York artists at that time. I also was fascinated to learn, I had no idea that Marian Goodman started off by selling, that her gallery was called Multiples, and that she started off selling, you know, prints essentially. To me, there's something that that relates, I think, to what you were saying before about Jim Jacobs, who, you know, would get posters signed and sell those for small amounts of money, but it would be enough cash to keep things afloat. Can you talk a little bit about like the market side of that, like the demand? Who was buying, like how?
Who was buying multiples?
Well, yeah, and just, I mean, that the idea, so much of the book towards the end especially focuses on essentially a very small group of collectors paying exorbitant amounts of money for very expensive works of art. But it's such a big market, and there's something to me about the posters and the multiples as being a kind of gateway almost for developing future collectors.
Well, the name that comes to mind for me is Don Marin, whom I mentioned before, this collector who didn't start out as a wealthy Wall Street guy. He just loved art, and he first started collecting Hudson River Valley paintings because they're really not that expensive. You could get a nice painting for $5,000 or $7,000. And then he graduated from that to prints. And he said to me in one of our interviews rather defensively, he said, you know, prints are art. And that's why I collected them. And he actually got hundreds of them. And he just loved the image that he could look at because he had bought this thing and put it on his wall. But you're right, it is sort of curious that people would take that as seriously as paintings themselves. I think that for Marian, it was as much a matter of establishing a new life for herself. She had a rocky marriage, and this was a way to create a new life. She created her own gallery shortly after that, and then she's a wonderful lady. She's about 80. She's just like your little Jewish grandmother, and she seems like an incredibly sweet woman, and she's actually a really tough negotiator. And she's also clever enough to have signed up Richter, Gustav Garrick, thank you, Gerhard Richter, who some people would say is the most commercially successful artist in the world, certainly one of them. And she's represented a lot of other artists, but Marian Goodman is revered as a principled, passionate dealer, and also as Richter's dealer.
Yes.
So actually, you know, I should say that when I speak about the four mega dealers, and we'll go back to that, I hope at some point. I always think of, and I think I even said in the book, that Marian is sort of like the fifth. She's the other four are men, and Marian is, as I say, very sort of unprepossessing, but she is as tough and successful as any of them.
Absolutely. Can you, you know, there's something about, you know, in the current moment, you have these mega dealers whose galleries represent almost close to 100 artists.
Yeah.
Whereas, you start off with Betty Parsons, who has 8 or 10. Leo Castelli, it's probably around that, maybe
Yeah.
growing to 12 to 15. When I was starting out my career in New York, Matthew Marks had no more than 12, and that was I think maybe even 10, and that was very, very deliberate. Now with these larger dealers, the largest dealers, representing so many, but then you have, and I so appreciated you talking about Lisa Cooley in your book. She's a friend of mine.
Oh, okay.
That there was the start of a new New York moment almost in the Lower East Side. Yeah, right, like basically around the recession, because the rents were so much less than Chelsea, and it was kind of cultivating a whole new generation of both dealers and
Recession, you mean?
2008.
2008, okay, yeah.
Sorry. It was creating a new, kind of a new dealer cohort as well as artist cohort and ultimately collector cohort. Where I'm getting at is, in the current moment, so many of those smaller dealers have had to close up their shops.
Right.
And these megas are getting ever larger and ever more,
Right.
the kind of monopolies are starting to almost
Sure.
appear. Can you talk a little bit about that and about, kind of how, what the attitude is from the dealer's perspective
Sure.
towards that kind of immense growth?
I think of it as almost two separate issues. The big dealers who now have 100 artists is one thing that's got its own pros and cons, and then the struggles of a small dealer like Lisa Cooley are almost something else again, different league, different problems. But I certainly think that for the big dealers who do now carry 100 or more artists, it's initially exciting for the artist to be taken aboard one of these big motherships, one of these mega dealers, but they become aware pretty early on that the clock is ticking. They might only have it 2 or 3 years. If they don't sell, if the shows don't make any business, they're going to be slid out of there, and it can actually be very injurious to your career to find yourself without that mega gallery. And so that's problematic. On the other hand, it is true that many of these top galleries now have multiple locations. So there's just that much more wall space, and there's that much more chance that these artists can be shown. Pros and cons there. There's a whole other sort of thing going on with the small to mid-range dealers, those galleries that maybe just have a few artists. And traditionally, these were the galleries that made contemporary art happen, right? I mean, they discovered artists who no one else was looking at, and 1 out of 100 turned out to be the real thing. And so they proudly displayed this artist in ever greater venues. And then what happened? The big fish came along and ate the little fish. The big galleries poached the new hot artists from the little gallery. And that process has only accelerated in the last 5 or 10 years. I'll give you one example I like from the book, a guy named Joe Bradley, who he's a young guy. He grew up in Maine, came to New York from RISD, and he had a very, let's call it a spare style. He basically drew stick figures. And then he would take the canvas with the stick figure on it. If there was ever a case where you could say, my kid could do this, that was the case. And he'd take it, he'd put it, and he'd rub it around so it would have this sort of patina to it, And the gallery that took him on was called Canada. It's a small gallery on the Lower East Side. Really nice people. I went to spend some time with them, and they loved Joe, but they were chagrined. Why? Because one thing led to another. Joe's shows at Canada got discussed a lot. A lot of people were really annoyed. What does this guy think he's doing, drawing stick figures? But they kept talking. And so a very smart dealer whom I came to like a lot, Gavin Brown, thought, if people are talking about this guy, maybe he's something. Maybe I should give it a closer look. So he poached Joe Bradley from Canada. And then Joe Bradley had some success, I think a Whitney Biennial, this and that. He tried a few other approaches, let the stick figures go. I think it was a good idea. And he actually began to get written up and talked about in a wider area. So what happened, Gagosian poached him. And he's been with Gagosian for, I guess, maybe 2 years. And, you know, the prices on his work go up, they go down. There are shows, Gagosian is clearly pushing them, but it's not clear yet whether he'll succeed. What is clear is that Canada Gallery lost its star and has to start all over again. And that's really such a problem for everybody, because if the really talented emerging artist isn't given enough time to be nurtured by the small gallery, and if the gallery itself isn't able to get its investment back by selling some of these early works, then where are they supposed to come from, you know? Instead, you have a situation where there aren't enough, even though there's so many artists, there aren't enough really great ones. So that's a problem.
It reminds me of how, maybe about 15 years ago, dealers started to go straight to the MFA shows
yes.
at Yale and Columbia and, 2 other schools, probably UCLA maybe.
Wasn't it called zombie something?
Zombie formalism.
Zombie formalism.
But dealers, older artists were, aghast that,
right.
That dealers were being were kind of grabbing artists at such a young age before, to your point, before they had fully matured or more fully kind of matured and experimented, and instead they would kind of get chosen, and you get chosen for this one thing, and then the artists were conditioned to kind of stay with that thing because that's what's saleable or whatever.
Well, the artists were, as greedy as the dealers, I suppose, in fairness. I mean, they would go to the MFA program, they'd come out, they'd expect that in 5 years they'd have a dealer, in 10 years they'd be having their retrospectives, and everything, the paintings would be selling for lots and lots. Instead, what you saw was, it's like a stock market, shooting up, shooting down. I mean, people who had very short half-lives as artists.
Absolutely. I think, it's funny, we did a program in November with people involved with the Francesca Woodman exhibition that's upstairs, and they talked a lot about how in the 70s, the idea of making money off of your photographs was like comical. There was never any, forget ambition that would happen. There was no market existed for that. If people were buying photographs, it was Ansel Adams or something, or Walker Evans, or something from the 19th century. And so it's what you're talking about, the phenomenon. It's so recent, but it's so powerful that in the last 10 to 15 years that is a kind of expectation, for a certain cadre of artists who do kind of follow this path, and the path becomes like de rigueur almost.
And then other things play into that, like the art fairs. Back when Leo Castelli was alive, he died in 1999, and I almost think of that as a hinge right there, when the art world sort of became the art market. And one of the things that happened was that these art fairs, which had always existed, but in a small number, proliferated madly. Suddenly, every country had its own art fair, and dealers all felt the obligation to go on those art fairs, to rent booths, and to try to sell works, because if they didn't, for one thing, their artists would say, "Hey, why weren't you out there representing me in that last fair?" And if they did go and they didn't sell anything, which could happen, then they were plumb out of luck. I mean, they could go broke after a couple art fairs. So, and that whole process has only accelerated. The market, there's more of it as the market gets bigger and bigger, but not everybody wins. Another thing that's happened to affect all this is the sheer proliferation of billionaires. Back in 1987, when Forbes did its first international billionaires list, there were, I think, about 200 of them. Now there are about 2,000 of them. And a billionaire can buy a lot of contemporary art. And they do, because they run out of things to buy. They really do. And they can always, put a Christopher Wool painting on their wall, knowing that all their guests will know just how much you paid for it, which is always part of the satisfaction. So that's another factor as well. And then another one is auction houses. The degree to which auction houses have sort of, put more flame under the pot, if you will. It used to be that auction houses only auctioned off the work of artists who were long dead. Now, not only are they alive, but sometimes they're those kids just out of the MFA program. And it sort of accelerates everything in a dangerous way.
Was the skull auction at Sotheby's, was that one of the first that
Yes.
sold art by living artists?
Yes.
The
First evening sale, okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
I don't know. I mean, I think there were sales of living artists before, but it wasn't such a wide-ranging sale of all the artists who had been working in the 60s and the early 70s. And it shocked everyone, and it made everyone realize that there was a great deal more money in this than they'd anticipated. But this is not to say that a lot of great art isn't being made. It is, and it's not to say that the dealers are doing anything wrong exactly. They're trying to survive themselves, and sometimes they're actually as encouraging and enterprising as the artists. One of my favorite stories from the book is about this guy Gavin Brown I mentioned before. He's an English dealer. He has a sort of piratical look to him, this long black hair. You can almost imagine him with bullet belts draped on either side. He's a very cantankerous guy, but he's really smart, and he has helped the careers of some of the artists I particularly like. Peter Doig is one, Chris O'Feely is another. But the story in my book is that one day, Gavin Brown goes off for lunch, leaving his downtown gallery. And when he comes back, his friend Urs Fischer is there, an artist, with a whole team jackhammering the floor. And in fact, creating this deep pit right in the floor of Gavin Brown's gallery. Now, some people might get a little annoyed by this, right? But not Gavin. He got it immediately. Like, right, I get it. This is art. And Urs Fischer said, yes. And so Gavin Brown then calls his friend Peter Brandt, who's a well-known collector you may have heard of. He's up in Greenwich, Connecticut. And Peter Brandt is very excited about the hole, so he buys it. This is true story. So he buys it. I said to Gavin, okay, but what did he do with it? He said, well, he moved it to Greenwich. I said, wait a minute. Now, he moved the hole to Greenwich. Yeah. He dug a new hole there, and that was the hole now, instead of the one in the gallery. I said, Gavin, this really sounds crazy. And he said, it is. It is actually kind of crazy. He said, Peter Brandt's crazy, Urs is crazy, I'm kind of crazy. But here's the thing. It's like a train. You're either on it, or you just got to get off and go somewhere else, because this is where the train's going. And if you want to be credited for being at the front in the front car, that's what you got to do. You got to buy the hole. So.
I think I saw the hole about 5 or 6 years ago when I was in Los Angeles at Urs Fischer's retrospective at
Really?
MoCA. Yes, it was a very big hole.
Yeah, it was a very big hole. Yeah, we were at Basel, my wife and I, a couple of years ago, to get some color for the opening of this book, and Urs Fischer was there being represented at Larry Gagosian's booth, and he was being represented by these 2 life-size wax candles of figures. One of them, the well-known dealer,
Bruno.
Thank you,
Bischofberger, yeah.
Bruno, and the other one, his wife. And I said, well, what's this about? And it was explained to me that there's a wick, at the top of this wax thing, and you buy it, and then when you want to, you light the candle. That's what you buy for, guess what, $950,000. And it turned out that day that 3 people bought them. So at least lending a little bit of sanity to this, they apparently have this kind of canister that slips into the bigger, life-size wax candle. And when you've burned that down, you can buy another one without having to burn down the whole candle. That one does cost $50,000, however. So, anyway, yes, Urs Fischer, what a guy.
Well, the Peter Brandt connection leads me to my next question, which is to talk about private museums.
Oh, good, yes.
Because he recently opened another private museum in New York that's extraordinary. That was Walter de Maria's former home and studio.
He did. Yeah, downtown East 6th Street or something, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So you spend some time on it at the end of the book. Why, and maybe we can just talk about it a little bit for the audience, the idea, historically, frankly, all of the wonderful museums that we have, encyclopedic museums that we have, are the collections that define them.
That's true.
Were basically formed by gifts from, incredibly wealthy art collectors and philanthropists, Paul Mellon, Rockefeller.
But this is slightly different.
Well, so that's what I'm getting at, is that there's, in the current moment, the idea of, amassing this collection and then giving it to a museum is certainly not as, it obviously still happens quite a bit, but instead there's this other kind of alternative that's happening, which is this rise of the private museum. Right.
I find that one of the most fascinating developments in this whole saga. The one I looked at in particular is called Glenstone, and it's down in Potomac, near Washington, D.C., in the countryside, and the couple who created it, Mitch and Emily Rales, interesting story in and of themselves. Mitch Rales, very wealthy private equity guy or whatever, Wall Street guy, who collected art, but just in a sort of perfunctory way, the way billionaires will. And he was then in Russia on some sort of like salmon fishing trip, and he was in a helicopter, and the helicopter landed back on the tarmac, and he got out and he walked away, and the helicopter blew up. He was only 10 feet away from it when that happened. And he decided this was a message to change his life. And he did. He pretty much got out of all the money stuff. He focused on what he cared about, which was this art collection. And his wife, as it happens, worked at Matthew Marks, so she could be very helpful to him. And they started collecting all this art very much from the whole period that I've been interested in, from post-war up until now. And recently, they doubled the size and put that much more art in there. And it's now, I believe, the biggest private museum in the country, like 200,000 square feet. Well, so is this good? Is it bad? Kind of both. It's good in the sense that these people who care about great art are paying money to collect it and protect it and have it in their gallery. But, it's not so great in a few other ways. One is that this couple is very unlikely to give a lot of art to the Metropolitan Museum or to any other, encyclopedic museum or to MoMA. I mean, they want to have their own museum, and they want to call the shots. And so the public museums are deprived of that. And also, the private museums have power. They can go to the Met and say, well, we'll loan you these paintings for a show if you do this for us. And they may persuade the museum to take on a show, to put up a show on some artist that the rails are more excited about than the museum is. But the rails have that power too. So I don't know. I find it a little disconcerting. I believe there's something like 300 private museums now
There's I mean, it's grown exponentially in the
Right.
last decade for sure. I think the problem is that some of them exist as museums with great tax benefits.
That's the other thing,
But
exactly right.
they don't necessarily, and listen, I'm all for more museums. It's great as long as they're like open and accessible and
Well, that's
available
right.
to the public, and school
And when you
groups
first
and
went
whatever
to
it is.
when you first went to Glenstone, you wouldn't be let in if you said you were a journalist. That was pretty interesting to me. And for several years, they were very wary of the public in every sense. They've gotten better. They've gotten much better about
Yes.
that. But you raise a point. The tax thing, I did a little digging in them. I wrote an article about them. The tax deal is very advantageous to them. Let's put it that way. I mean, almost anything they spend buying art or extending the gallery up until a certain point is tax deductible. And if they were going to do it anyway, then nice to get the tax benefit. So that is an issue. And the other thing is, you mentioned private families giving or bequeathing huge collections to a public museum. I think generally the idea is they do that without insisting on controlling the art. If they're going to give it, then the museum gets it, and the museum can decide whether to put some of that art in the basement, even though the benefactors might be happy with that. But you're not going to see that happen with the private museum.
No, absolutely not. And I think, I've had a conversation with some other museum directors who are starting to think about what do we do? We have so much art that's in storage that needs to be, maintained at a certain temperature and certain humidity, and more work than we could ever show. Even if we stopped collecting right now, most of the stuff will never be brought out. What are we doing? Why are we continuing in this vein? And starting to think kind of radically about
This is museums thinking that way?
museum
Okay.
directors, yes, because they're stewards. We are, I mean, this is a non-collecting museum, but essentially, you are, it is your responsibility to maintain and to care for and to exhibit and to study all the works that are, that you own now and that you're responsible for. But what are we doing by amassing more and more and more and more? Because we're creating huge burdens in other areas.
Yeah.
Storage facilities, conservation costs, traveling them for loans to other places. It just is, it's soon to reach a point because the insurance valuation on all these works is rising so high that it's getting to a point in the not too distant future where the model is no longer, it's just not going to be sustainable.
Haven't we already gotten to the point where some museums are deaccessioning?
Oh, absolutely,
works?
absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's always happened, but I think they're gonna have to think of another course of action besides that.
Yeah.
And there are some ideas out there.
Didn't the San Francisco Museum do something kind of creative?
Well, the
when-
Baltimore Museum and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art are doing something that is radical, but in a slightly different way, which is that they have deaccessioned works of art by white, male, American, and European men. So a Warhol, a Rothko, works that by artists who they have in more depth, and they're selling them through the auction houses, and using the funds generated by that to buy artists who are either women artists, artists of color, artists who have been historically underrepresented in their collections, which is a great, I think, an impressive strategy, but it's still it's still acquiring and collecting. Yeah, it doesn't get to the problem.
No, that's tricky.
I think, Michael, if it's okay with you, maybe we open it up to the audience for a couple of questions. Would that be okay?
We've just been here for 10 minutes. What are you talking about? Oh, my God. Okay.
So I put it to you, our wonderful audience. Is there anyone who has questions? Oh, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Ellen, why don't you stand up if you don't mind?
What is the role of art consultants in the current market? You talked about galleries.
Right. Yeah, good point. Well, art consultants were very big in the OOs. I'm not sure they're as big now. I mean,
I think
you think they are as much? Well, it's a great gig because you look for one rich collector who doesn't know as much about art as you do, and you make a lot of money. I mean, I guess there's nothing wrong with it exactly. Do you see anything wrong with art consultants?
I think that when you find someone who's really excellent in that role, they can be extraordinary. But I
Right.
think that there are a lot who are not excellent, and it creates, I think it emphasizes certain values that get perpetuated that maybe are, or certain artists or certain ideas or certain trends that maybe shouldn't have the legs that they eventually get. So I think that they're arbiters, the art consultants, they're mediators, and they have created their own market essentially to become kind of
Sure.
indispensable to these rich collectors who want to do something, don't have the time or don't have the background or what have you. And the really, really great ones focus on educating their clients, taking them to museums, encouraging them to get involved in museums, to not buy at an art fair, because under that time pressure, it's the worst time to
Yes.
actually make such a big decision, and to really kind of steer them in a thoughtful way. But I think there are a lot who don't and who see the cash cow that it is. And
Yes. Yeah, I think they're the subject of a lot of scorn from those who feel, also feel infringed upon. I mean, because the art consultant can kind of come to you as a dealer and say, well, I got this rich client here, here's what we're going to do, and take it or leave it. Dealers don't like that.
Absolutely, and they take a cut. And
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you expand a little bit? You kind of touched on, you mentioned Art Basel. What is the relationship between some of these dealers and stuff like that in terms of things like the Venice Biennial and those types of shows that
You mean, do they go to those shows?
Well,
or-
are they influenced in those types of things, or are they?
Yes.
Because the biennial's been around for
Yeah.
100 years, right?
Yes. I think the Whitney Biennial, though it's always stirring up, controversy, is actually, just to start with that, since you just mentioned it, I think it can often bring up very talented new artists. Who was one recent one? Henry Taylor, isn't it?
oh yeah.
But as far as the fairs go, yes, I mean, there's, I would say, 10 or 15 that if you're really in the business, you really need to go to every year, not just so you could see what's going on, but so that other people can see what artists are being represented by you. And there is a school of thought that that you don't need to do it as much or at all, that if you're looking to see really cutting edge art, you won't necessarily find it at the art fair. You'll find the more predictable pieces by artists whose work has been making the rounds of those fairs. So, but that said, I would say if you possibly can, as a dealer, you certainly want to be at Basel. You do want to be in Venice. You don't necessarily have to be at some of the more esoteric festivals.
Between the dealer and the artist, did you find any dealers influencing what was selling to push the artist in a certain direction, like make a bigger painting, scale them up? What kind of relationship did you find there?
Well, Larry Gagosian, for one, is said to often encourage his artists to do bigger art, with the idea that the bigger the art, the bigger price it'll get. That may be a bum rap on him. I've just seen it said. I didn't hear in all my reporting, and I talked to probably 70 or 80 dealers. No one talked about how they guided their artists one way or another. I think they would be embarrassed to do that. It would be what you don't do as a dealer. What you do as a dealer is you stand back and you let your great prodigy, bloom, and you just focus on the business. That said, I mean, there are obviously artists who have very close relationships with their dealers, and maybe that does affect their work. I mean, one of the artists I spoke with late in the game was Frank Stella, who's still very much with us. And he said that he had come to Castelli in the mid-'60s, early 60s, 1960 actually. Castelli put him on a stipend. So every week or month or whatever it was, he got enough money to live. And he told me that stipend stayed on from 1960 to 1969 because it took him that long to actually make a profit from his work. He was showing, but he wasn't making a profit. I think a dealer like that, the friendships are actually very tight. Is it that way today? I don't know. What do you think?
I just don't know how, I love Mark Glimsher. I think he's wonderful and he's got great ambition, but how can you focus on 100 artists
Right.
the same way? I just don't know how that's possible, humanly possible. So I don't, I think some certainly do, and I think it's probably a case-by-case basis. I know an artist who is represented by a dealer in Europe and was, a number of years ago was picked up by Zwerner, and Zwerner said, make them bigger. I mean, that's what I heard. I don't know. But I think that it shocks me not at all that
Right.
someone said that to him.
Right.
I think, however, when you were talking earlier about the rising generation of artists who expect, right after the MFA, they're going to do this. I don't know that they necessarily want that feedback from their dealer. I think they
No.
want to, there's some who very much want to be profitable and make a splash and have a really robust career because of that. So I think certain artists probably need the counsel more than others.
I agree.
Yes.
How would you say that art dealers are different or similar than literary agents or talent agents? I mean, there are a lot of industries out there that have representatives for the artist or the talent. I'm just wondering if you have any sense of nuance of similarities or differences.
Just speaking as a writer who's had literary agents, I could go a year or two without seeing my agent if I've been working on something. They don't need to hear from me. Maybe with art, it's a more ongoing relationship, would be my guess. But it's hard to be certain about that.
Sounds right. Well.
Do you see social media more accessible people getting smaller and flatter, the distribution of art changing, artists getting more access to the public? But it seems like galleries
Yes.
have this validation of big-time art. People want to go to
Certainly.
artists and buy the brand, but
Right.
it seems like it could be promising for pricing of art, distribution of art, access to art, and really technological change that might be a lot different. Dealers might be disruptive.
Certainly, you might not buy a painting on Instagram, but you like looking at them, and artists like being sure that you are looking at them. Then to flip that, the whole idea of people coming in and taking snapshots of themselves with the art and whatnot. I guess it gets the word out, the way social media does. I mean, we were talking a little bit at one point about this issue, and I certainly feel that while more and more collectors or potential collectors do go online to look at art, and there's almost every image that was created in the last 30 years can quickly be seen with a keystroke or two. You don't necessarily buy that way. In fact, you don't buy from Zwerner in London. Most people just want to buy in New York. Somehow there's an imprimatur. If you're at the central gallery of the dealer, that's where you want to be to buy the work. So, does it help excite people to go in and look at the gallery? Probably. Beyond that, I'm not sure what social media is yet doing. What do you think, Nora?
I think it is generating so much interest in the artist and in the market. I think it's contributing in part to why people are here tonight. They want to know how has this phenomenon kind of emerged, and how does it continue to grow and expand so rapidly? And I think artists themselves are recognizing how much power they have through their social media channels to enhance their brand essentially, but really enhance their price.
Well, this
as a
point about
result.
artists and power is interesting. One change we're seeing is that for the artists who are at the top, they can really dictate to their dealers in a way that didn't used to happen. For instance, Richard Prince at one point, Larry Gagosian told me this, he was so hurt. He said that Richard Prince for a few years had 5 dealers representing him in New York at the same time, each one for a different show or something. And he's Richard Prince, so he could do that, and they would agree. But Gagosian said, "This is crazy. Why does he need more than me?" Essentially, and it's that, or it's a guy like Mark Grosjean, who's a wonderful, very successful artist. Who also can have multiple dealers and has been accused, or at least said to have, sold paintings out the back door, as it were. In other words, to actually just sell them on his own to someone who wants to buy them rather than going through his own dealer.
Well, and there's an artist in New York who runs an organization called Pioneer Works, Dustin Yellen. I don't know if you ever met him in your research, but he doesn't work with any dealer, and he created this nonprofit arts organization that's incredible, that does everything: classes, food, all kinds of art forms, gallery space. There's an art fair that takes place there, but he also has his studio adjacent to it, and he sells his works for like $250,000. But he's doing it himself. And
is he keeping track of it, though? You see,
Oh,
because
yes.
What you
He's
really
got a
don't
whole
want
studio.
is to
Yeah.
sort of lose track of the art, so nobody can be sure that it's authentic down the
No,
line.
it's a fair point. But he's created his own machine. Like he figured out the machine that is the mega, and he
became his
became
own
it
little
hi-
mega.
Exactly, for himself.
Mega me.
Exactly. And frankly, I think in 10, 15 years, with manipulating social media in the right way, we're probably going to see more of that.
Yeah. The dealer as endangered species.
That's your next book.
Yeah, right.
All right, everyone. Listen, thank you all so much for being here tonight. Michael, I can't thank you enough. This was
Oh, you're
such
very
a
welcome.
wonderful conversation. I want to just thank one other person, Serena Robinson, who is the connector who enabled this whole thing to happen. Thank you so much for so graciously suggesting this. And thank you. This was wonderful.
Well, thank you.